Thank you, Adrian, for that introduction. And super happy to be here and kick the third edition of GraphQL Asia off. I am going to be talking a little bit about GraphQL and developer productivity via data-oriented architecture. So this is this is a topic that I think is a little bit future facing, and it's going to be very interesting to kind of share some of these ideas and the way things are evolving with everybody here. And then of course I'll have some time towards the end, so would love to take some questions from you folks as well, time permitting. But that said, let us dive in. So when we I hope you can see my slides. All right. So before I start things off, a quick introduction. I'm Tanmai. I'm the CEO, co-founder at Hasura. I before starting Hasura, I had done a whole bunch of things, and it's interesting because that kind of given me a fairly interesting perspective when I kind of approach this topic of developer productivity, and we start talking about kind of the way architectures are evolving, right? Just to give you a sense of the kinds of stuff that I've been up to, is I built my own full stack framework. I did it with Django and jQuery based SPA framework. And many years ago, before when SPAs were just becoming a thing, which was a framework by Twitter. I actually happened to meet the creator of Flight one day in San Francisco, and he was like, "You're the first user that I've met in person." And I was like, "Yes, I was probably one of the few users there." And this was actually a framework based off of jQuery before React and stuff were popular. And then of course, you early users of compared to Redux, and then kind of other ways of state handling that have emerged since then. I also built when we built kind of our own data access engine before Hasura. The API that we used was very similar to GraphQL. It was like GraphQL in JSON, and that was also a very interesting exercise. And then as a part of the kind of the previous company that I used to run, the work that we used to do along with the team, we built several types of different tools, everything from kind of database orchestrators, API gateways, CI/CD tooling, and whatnot, right? And the reason I mentioned this is because as we kind of talk about evolving architectures, I was a big fan of reinventing as many different as many different things as I possibly could get my hands on, right? And it was an interesting exercise because it was fun to do, and it was fun to use that learn and to try them out with companies large and small, some of the largest companies in the world, with some of the with some people who are just getting started, right? And then of course, one of the things that I did that I really enjoyed, that still kind of lends me perspective today, is a massively open online course that I ran called Introduction to Modern Application Development, which became one of the largest MOOCs in the world at the time. And that was also very interesting because there's this kind of this gap that people have in being able to consume ways of doing modern development and actually kind of building with it, right? And trying to understand what that gap is and what kinds of problems people face, right? And so it's been a fairly interesting journey when we think about this overall idea of, what are the kinds of things that we need to do to make ourselves productive, and what are kind of the key bottlenecks, right? And what are those challenges like? So that's just to set some context about kind of where I'm coming from, right? with that, let me dive in straight into GraphQL. So when we think about, and this is I've said this before, but I used to be a GraphQL skeptic, right? And and it took me some time to fall in love with GraphQL, um, and and even now, three years in to our journey with GraphQL, maybe 5 to 6 years in with the journey for everybody in the world with GraphQL, right? It's very interesting to kind of talk about why people like GraphQL, right? Mm, When GraphQL when GraphQL was kind of born, right? It was kind of born out of two important problems that needed to be solved um, at and when this happened at Facebook, there were two fairly kind of important problems that they were running into, and and GraphQL was kind of born as a specification out of that, right? One of the first big problems was that if you have a UI and this UI needs a lot of pieces of data, right, to render itself. Composing all of that data and effectively making a single API call required a tremendous amount of manual work, right? As a developer, I would have to go in and say, okay, this component, I make this API call, but then I know that it's kind of overlapping with this piece here. So let me fetch it in a way that I can share some data, right? And then we realize that wait, but both of these elements are part of a larger element. So maybe I can just make a larger API call, get the full JSON object, right? Stuff that we all know about very well, right? The and when we think about the tremendous amount of manual effort that was involved in kind of in putting this together, uh, people wanted, and there was this need for saying that to make developers more productive, we're going to need some kind of automation here to help compose this together. The second piece, and so the things, the effects that you see in GraphQL today of that kind of composition stuff is GraphQL fragments and the relay specification for GraphQL, right? And these are two things that we actually don't use that often with GraphQL, right? Most people who are using GraphQL, if you ask them, hey, are you using GraphQL fragments? They're like, um, are you using the relay style specification of GraphQL? And they're like, maybe, but they're few and far between. Now, that's not to say I don't love both of these aspects. I do, and I in fact talked about this last year, which was a journey for me to kind of fall in love with the relay style of GraphQL, which is very different and is extremely interesting. And once you understand that, you're like, why? How can we build UIs in any other way? It doesn't make any sense, right? Um, but it's still a little bit. Uh, it's a little bit kind of it's a little bit harder to it's a little bit harder to get used to as a specification, but it's a very powerful specification because it solves that problem of being able to kind of compose a UI very well, right? And then the second problem is type safe JSON interaction, right? Which is JSON as an untyped API. You have clients and servers talking to each other. There has to be some type safety. Otherwise, how do you enforce how do you enforce that type safety if it's not going to happen with JSON? Everybody will have to do it in application code. Humans will have to do it themselves and take care of it, right? There'll be just a lot of unnecessary repetitive code that people are writing to validate the JSON that they're sending and the JSON that they're receiving, right? Now, when we think about these two reasons, right, they're massively important reasons, but if you think about why GraphQL is popular today amongst all of us, if you were all sitting in, for example, a conference hall and you looked at your neighbor and you asked them, hey, so why do you love GraphQL? Chances are that they'll kind of say something similar, right? And we'll all say something kind of similar to these reasons behind kind of the birth of GraphQL. But honestly, the biggest reason, right, why people really like GraphQL today, from what I've seen, and one of the most common reasons is that it is quite probably the best way today of being able to explore and try and integrate a new API, right? there just isn't anything better, right? If you've manually had to look at like hundreds of API endpoints and you've tried to use them, and tried to kind of figure out what API call does what, read pages of documentation is outdated, somebody else comes in and updates, has to update that documentation, you have to verify it with another human being, then you try it out, right? There's a whole thing around it that's very painful when you're consuming APIs. And then when you suddenly first kind of look at you look at GraphQL, this it kind of blows your mind. You're like, yes, this is what I've wanted from APIs all along, right? Obviously, all of my data is interconnected. I want to go in and I want to go in and I want to go in and fetch all of that information when I want it. I want to query for it exactly the way I want, right? And so and the ability to kind of explore that API incrementally, right? Just by kind of auto completing. And then if you look at tools that have kind of gotten created since then, like Graphical Explorer and whatnot, they really help this, right? So so it's a slightly different use case, right? From this use case of saying that it's specifically a thing that makes automatic composition easier, right? Or it's specifically only for type safety. It goes kind of beyond both of those two, for a good reason, right? And that reason is that when we think about what we really want from an API, right? Um, what we really kind of want when we want things like GraphQL, um, uh, there are two things, right? The first is that we want self-serve APIs. So what that means is that we want this ability to not have to wait on somebody else to get the API that I want, right? I I don't want to wait on another team, another human, on another process for any part of the API lifecycle. I don't, when I'm browsing APIs, I'm exploring it, I'm trying it, I'm integrating it, right? Any of this, I don't want anybody else involved because I just want to go in and do it myself. Right. And this is the story of development world over, right? It's the story of a developer. The developer's like, I need to get some stuff done. I will go and figure out how to get stuff done myself and I will do it. Right. I will use these libraries, I'll use these services, I'll use a particular framework, I'll do whatever, and I can get stuff done. Right. And that individual is massively empowered when that individual is allowed to kind of get productive, by not being blocked on other things and other people, right? And that is kind of this massive underlying need that has made GraphQL extremely popular, which is saying that, hey, if you want a particular way of querying the data, or you want a particular way of, or you want to browse the API, you don't have to wait for anybody. You don't have to wait for the best handwritten documentation. You don't have to wait for anybody to send you any material. You skip a large part of the API onboarding that you would typically have to do, right? You'd have to have a conversation between people talking about, hey, this is what our APIs are like, and somebody else is like, yes, this is interesting, nice for me to see what this API is like. I can start integrating it, right? This whole process just goes away. It's self-serve, right? The second big thing about GraphQL is that you can query what you want and whenever you want it, right? Um, that means that, again, without having to be blocked on anybody else, when I need to query for a certain slice of data, I can query that slice of the API, right, on demand, and I can fetch exactly what I want. um, Now this, again, there are multiple kind of reasons here, right? Like there's a performance and a network impact here, uh, which was a big part of the kind of GraphQL Genesis story, which was to say, hey, we have to kind of make our network transfer more efficient because every byte matters, especially at the scale that Facebook was at. And so being able to kind of make those payloads efficient was really important. But when we think about, but even as humans, right? Um, in data models and API models are becoming massive, right? Like a person probably has 100 fields and then a million interconnected things, right? So if I want to keep my sanity while browsing an API, I want to fetch the fewest number of things possible, so that the kind of my cognitive overload is low, right? And I'm just fetching those few things. I don't actually want to fetch one JSON object that contains 100 fields and then some nested objects and lists and this and that, because I'll go crazy, right? And this ability to kind of query what we wanted whenever we wanted is really huge, and it's super important, right? Mm, and I think that these two kind of underlying reasons, right, behind the popularity of GraphQL, but also everything else, right? Also a lot of other tools that we use, is important to take kind of cognizance of, right? Because they have a massive impact on developer productivity, beyond kind of just the technical features of GraphQL, right? There's a certain kind of human and organizational power here that we're talking about, which is to productivity, right? Which is beyond just a technical benefit. Mm. And then if you take a step back, right, it kind of sounds like the database story, but for APIs, right? This idea of saying that it's self-serve and you can query for what you want, right? It's like the database story brought forward, right? And just to give you an example, and I'm sure most of us have worked with databases. Imagine the world before a database, right? There were only files, and then you wanted to get data, you had to fetch each file, right? And maybe the data was split across files. Maybe once you fetch the files, you had to process them. That's ridiculous, right? Like you're just getting pieces of data. I mean, it makes you would start like getting very angry with the work that you're doing and with people if that's how you have to interact with data, right? And then when SQL came along, and believe it or not, one of the most one of the killer developer tools of its time was actually Oracle. Um, and when SQL and databases came out, people just right, they were like, "What? I don't need expertise of like how to work with a file system and a disk to be able to fetch this data, right? I can just ask for it in this slight like human readable language, and I can just fetch whatever information I want. That's insane, right? And I don't need documentation telling me what file is what, and how things are laid out and what the structure is, and I can just kind of look at different tables and join across them and fetch the right records and filter by things and filter only the right columns, right? That was mind blowing. And GraphQL is very similar to kind of that journey, right? And that leap that we had in developer productivity, but for APIs, right? And when we think about what APIs are essentially a way for us to, I mean, there are lots of different ways to talk about it, but in this particular case, in the way I'd like to introduce it is that APIs will help us kind of interact programmatically with a particular domain, right? And a domain is a collection of data and logic, right? So each domain has data and logic that domain understands really well. That domain is represented by the data and logic, right? And these domains, especially if you're in an organization and you have multiple teams, these domains are owned and operated by different teams, right? And so people expose APIs, and then maybe different teams talk to each other via APIs when they're building services or products, or maybe there's a consumer that is talking to multiple different domains and connecting that data, or connecting the kind of methods there, and using an API for doing that, right? And again, this is not particularly new. This has been around for a long time. I'm going to be using that kind of image quite frequently in the slide to represent a domain, which is a data plus logic. This is one of my better architecture diagrams. In this context, right, of when we think about kind of like APIs, and APIs for domains, um, uh, and we kind of think about GraphQL. A GraphQL layer allows us to kind of bring together the data and logic that is siloed in different domains, right? And that's very interesting, right? That's massive for a lot of us, because we're not just talking about the API productivity of a particular domain. We're talking about the API productivity across domains, right? Which is awesome. Um, and the way I think about this is that when we think about data and logic for each domain, right? And you have everyone's data and everyone's logic that's kind of split across, right? The data is kind of interconnected, or may not be interconnected, but usually has some connections, right? It's not like it's a graph of one form or or another, right? And and then when you're kind of invoking logic of a particular domain, what that logic is doing in that domain, right, is that it's modifying that data, right, and it's returning references to the modified data. That's what each piece of logic does, right? Modifies data, modifies state, and returns references to the modified piece of state, right? And so this is kind of what each domain is, and we want to kind of bring, and we kind of want to bring all of this. We kind of want to bring all of this information together, right? Um, and and this is kind of where we want to think about GraphQL, right? And it's a little bit confusing because this story doesn't necessarily work very well with GraphQL, because GraphQL is this kind of monolithic layer, and we're talking about different services, right? It doesn't fit into this kind of service-oriented architecture picture as naturally as we would want it to, right? And so, because it's a little bit different from the way that we think about our APIs, right? Um, and so one of the terms that I heard from, that I first came across from Adam in last year's Enterprise GraphQL conference was this notion of data-oriented architecture, which is a slightly easier way to kind of reorient yourself and think about GraphQL across services. And it's to say that, hey, why don't we shift towards a data-oriented architecture instead of a service-oriented architecture, right? In this particular in the talk that I'm referencing, which you should definitely go and watch by Adam. All right. I apologize, my animations are playing it. All right. So when they had this is literally the image that I've taken from Adam's slides, which is these are the kind of different services, and they're all interconnected and they're all calling each other, right? So this is kind of the RPC way of doing things, right? Where each service can make arbitrary RPCs or API calls to other services and invoke procedures, invoke logic, and logic returns data. You're invoking procedures, and procedures return information, right? That's the model. And that model, things, especially when you have an explosion of services, get a little bit messy. We're also now living in a context, right, where for a lot of developers, we might not even have a service. We might just have serverless functions that are running, right? And so you have different functions just running all over the place. And then like, wait, what happens now? Right? Like, do all of these functions call each other? This is worse than spaghetti code with go-to functions that we used to write back in the day. Well, actually never, right? But we heard about writing back in the day, right? So that and that was a problem, right? And so when they start thinking about kind of how they would unifying this, right? And they thought about using GraphQL, they said, let's think in terms of data. Let's say that each service, instead of exposing procedures, is actually exposing data, right? And it's finished data. It's data with logic, right? And so you're exposing that data. There's stuff that's happened to that data when you're exposing it. And there is this idea of saying that, okay, cool. You know what? We can kind of bring in data from these different places, and this data is interconnected, and something in the middle has to figure out how this data is kind of being pieced together. And that's kind of where their GraphQL infrastructure, which they've named Viaduct, starts fitting in, right? Is to say is that let's uh, thinking in terms of data is easier. I mean, maybe at the end of the day, it'll be the still same kind of number of spaghetti calls, but as a human, you won't see that happen, right? As a human, you'll see a nice kind of interconnected data, um, this cognitive graph of how your models are laid out, and then you can go query that, right? Very similar was a talk by the LinkedIn folks a few years ago, talking about kind of their internal data layer that they were building, which was also using GraphQL. And if you look at the diagram that I have on the right, which again I've taken from Gopal's slides, and again you should definitely watch that. Is if you look at in the kind of in the middle, right, you have these different domains, right? And if you look at like the top, and so this is kind of a very similar problem that the folks at LinkedIn were running into, which is that they also kind of wanted to solve a lot of these common problems with being able to deal with data and data of different types, data everywhere, data across domains, and they need a way of doing it, right? And they talk about kind of their emerging GraphQL architecture in that context, right? When the way that the kind of need for this, right, is developer productivity and making sure that things are kind of making sense when you have that explosion of the amount of data that you're going to have. You start off, even if you start off today with data in one place, it's almost instantly going to be data in like 5 different places, right? Maybe some are in different services in your own organization, maybe something is in a SaaS service, right? It's kind of all over. um, when we think about kind of the architectural, the mental model that we've had right so far, we think about this kind of a model, with this kind of picture that I've put together on the slide here, where you have different domains expose services, everybody runs an app server, then you kind of put that together and you have maybe an API gateway if you want to unify access across it, right? We're not talking about kind of the internal service to service interaction. That is still RPC type, right? Which is a little bit of what I was talking about before. But in this picture, right, when you think about the different types of problems to be solved, you think about logic, authorization, caching, security, unified API, the fact that your API gateway is a single point of failure. So it needs there's a lot of kind of non-functional work that goes into that API gateway to prevent it from being a single point of failure, right? So that's redundant, it's highly available, it can handle failovers of upstream services, all of that kind of stuff. But all of this work has to happen across the app server to the API gateway layer, right? And and this is a little bit this is not fun because you're not sometimes sure where should I be putting this caching logic. I need to put it in the app server, should I put it in the API gateway? Kind of makes sense in both places. Who they better at doing it? Why should I do it in one place or the other? Um, and at the end of the day, it's a repetitive problem that we're solving. Is everybody solving the same problem? Why don't we just do it in a central place? And there's like questions like that often come to mind, right? um, in in this kind of a data oriented way of thinking about things, right? You think of each domain as data plus logic, right? and and then you think of your GraphQL infrastructure as being slightly thicker than just a facade. And in this kind of with this kind of mental model, you're saying that, hey, we're going to connect these different domains, right? um, and each domain is data plus logic. That's it. And we try to pause that as much as possible. And all of the other stuff, especially stuff that's non-functional, but maybe also absorbing some of those other concerns, right? Like let's say caching or authorization, they can start going into your GraphQL infrastructure, right? And this becomes an interesting, this becomes kind of a slightly different way of thinking about things, right? At Hasura, we just announced Hasura 2.0 yesterday, which is a big deal for us. But we're thinking deeply about problems like this that will help with developer productivity. I'm gonna not talk about this too much in the interest of time as well, but there's several interesting kind of areas that we're working on in that kind of same space of doing things in the way that this architecture is evolving, right? Um, there are fairly real challenges ahead of us when we think about this kind of architecture in as a community, right? The first is that in the long term, when we think about simplifying things, we want layers to collapse. We want fewer number of things to do, not a larger number of things to do. For example, when you use the cloud today, think about the amount of technology that's collapsed, and you click on a button, you get a VM, right? It's just that makes people productive, right? You explode the number of layers, that's a short-term kind of thing. It's not necessarily making it productive, right? There are challenges here when we're thinking about the traditional ways of doing transactions and events and business logic workflows, right? You're like, how does that map into this kind of model when we're thinking about kind of these domains, right? How do we have logic across these domains, right? Where does that go? Is that another domain altogether? Is it not? And there are many different ways of, again, kind of approaching this problem. So it's not like, oh, here's a little diagram and this works, right? So it's a little bit different. But I think, and just before I close, I think that the future of GraphQL really depends on us being able to understand the why of why we're all using GraphQL and what we want from it before we kind of join the hype or propagate the hype and start cargo culting. And Rob Zhu from the first GraphQL Asia again had a kind of great talk around when you should not use GraphQL. But I think that is really important for us as builders and consumers of GraphQL systems to be able to kind of make sure that GraphQL evolves with us appropriately in the future. Um, I'll end with I'll end with this, which is a slightly bold vision, not maybe a bold vision, but maybe a slightly dreamy vision of where it would be amazing if you all got it together, right? And which is that, imagine that across the entire globe, right? Whether you're an organization or a team or a business or an individual, right? Um, you have a certain amount of data and logic, right? And it takes no amount of work for anybody to take that data and logic and to just be able to share it, right, with with anybody else, right? And it's super easy to consume, and there's no operations around it, right? There's just your data and your logic, and you don't have to operate it. And we're already, by the way, this is already happening in the world today, right? Because you're getting better and better databases as a service. You're getting more and more kind of compute as a service. You're just able to run a function and it works, right? And you don't have to think about, and the security kind of aspects of it are something that humans can understand, right? It's not so complicated that you can't understand. All of the complex stuff is baked into infrastructure. But all of the relevant stuff to you when you think about your security policies is something that you can understand. And again, this is what people are moving towards, especially where complexity is very high. But if this happened for every single thing, right, and every single entity, right, from all the way from individuals to like small businesses to large businesses, imagine the kind of productivity that we would unlock, right? We're not even at the beginning. Mm, uh, we, it's like the internet where we're all kind of communicating with each other, but now imagine that instead of that, it's this ability to kind of share domain information over an API with each other, right? That kind of API connected world is, we're still in the early phases of that kind of journey, right? And GraphQL can have an extremely kind of powerful role to play here, and to see that evolve as builders and consumers of GraphQL, I think is going to be absolutely amazing. But with that, I shall I shall stop and close. And sorry if I went a little bit over my time, and apologies for my net glitching out. I'm not sure if you have time to take questions, but I'll be hanging around here and I'll be on Twitter. So please feel free to reach out to me and have a chat with me. And welcome to GraphQL Asia 2021 again. And I am extremely excited for the rest of the talks over the next 2 days, talking about web productivity as well. Thank you for having me, and have fun over the next few hours.